You ever notice how some people from the 80s seem different? Not in a loud way, not in a back in my day kind of way, but in this quiet, unmistakable way where they're oddly self-reliant, emotionally tough, and somehow both nostalgic and skeptical at the same time. You might be one of them. You know, the kind of person who can sit in silence without panicking, who doesn't need constant notifications to feel alive, who remembers a time when boredom wasn't an emergency, it was just part of life. And here's the thing most people don't realize. Growing up in the 1980s didn't just shape your memories, it quietly rewired your psychology. Let's talk about why. Because the people who grew up in the 80s didn't just grow up in a different decade, they grew up in a completely different mental environment. If you grew up in the 80s, chances are you learned independence before you learned anxiety. You walked to school alone, you played outside until the streetlights came on, your parents didn't know where you were every second, and neither did you. That wasn't neglect, that was normal. And psychologically, it created something powerful, self-trust. You learned to solve problems without immediately asking for help. You learned to sit with boredom instead of escaping it. You learned that mistakes weren't emergencies, they were just part of growing up. That's why many people from this generation are calm in chaos. They don't panic easily. They've already been alone with their thoughts and survived it. But there's another side to that independence. Because when you grow up learning not to rely on anyone, you also learn not to ask for help. That's why many people from the 80s struggle to open up emotionally. Not because they don't feel deeply, but because they were taught quietly that handling things alone was strength. Then there's the boredom factor. People who grew up in the 80s lived through something modern brains almost never experience anymore. Long stretches of nothing. No endless scrolling, no instant entertainment, just time. And boredom, it turns out, is a powerful psychological tool. It forces creativity, it strengthens imagination, it builds patience. That's why so many people from that era are deeply creative thinkers. They learned how to entertain themselves, drawing, building, imagining entire worlds in their heads. But here's the twist. When you grow up training your brain to be stimulated internally, modern overstimulation can feel exhausting. Endless notifications, constant noise, a world that never shuts up. That's why many people from the 80s secretly crave silence. They're not antisocial, they're overstimulated. Then there's the emotional toughness. People who grew up in the 80s were rarely encouraged to talk about feelings. You didn't process emotions, you pushed through them. And while that built resilience, it also created emotional blind spots. Many learned to function through pain instead of understanding it, to joke instead of cry, to stay busy instead of vulnerable. That's why you'll often see people from that generation who seem unshakable on the outside, but deeply reflective on the inside. They feel things deeply, they just learn to carry it quietly. And here's the part few people talk about. Growing up in the 80s created a strange emotional contradiction. On one hand, there's nostalgia, a longing for simpler times, mixtapes, Saturday morning cartoons, riding bikes until dark. On the other hand, there's realism, a grounded understanding that life isn't fair, safe, or predictable. So people from that era often live in the space between hope and realism. Optimistic, but not naive. Sentimental, but not stuck. Independent, but quietly longing for connection. So if you ever feel like you don't fully belong in today's world, if you crave depth in conversations but hate small talk, if you're strong but tired, independent but secretly longing to be understood, it's not a flaw. It's the psychology of someone who grew up in a time that taught resilience before comfort. And maybe that's the real legacy of the 80s. Not the music, not the movies, but a generation that learned how to stand on its own, even when no one was watching. So tell me, do you recognize yourself in this? And if you do, maybe you're not behind the times at all. Maybe you're just built differently.
If this resonated with you, there's a lot more psychology like this coming. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the quiet patterns that shape who we are, the ones most people never stop to notice.